Welcome to our presentation day. This is a unique room. We're not normally in here, but I think this is really, really neat. It's actually different, and I like different. So we will, just in terms of process, and I think you all know this, we'll turn it over to you for the presentation, and then following that, we'll do our Q&A for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll go from there. All right?
Sounds good.
So with no further ado, you probably need a clicker.
I can just.
Or you can.
I can just press this.
That's fine.
Yeah, and I'll do it for
Yeah,
you.
and then
You
you'll
do it
just-
for me.
Yeah, that's fine.
Alright.
We'll turn it over to Vivian.
Alright. So hi, I'm Vivian, and on behalf of my colleagues, I'd first just like to thank Steve and California Strategies for giving us this opportunity to research a bit more about early child care and education in LA Unified School Districts. So our research question involves our goal, which was to analyze current barriers involving access to early child care and education in LA Unified School Districts. And this included barriers as diverse as the achievement gap, staffing issues, and various budgetary and funding problems. And as well, we're also going to be offering various potential solutions to move this issue forward. And first of all, I'll show you the current landscape of LA Unified's early child care and education. So obviously, early child care and education is very important for a large number of reasons. The majority of brain development occurs when children are very young, at an early age, definitely around the ages of 3 to 5 years old. And early child care and education, especially if it's high quality, plays a huge role in developing better social and emotional skills. Other benefits later on in life also include better standardized test performance, especially in math and reading, less likelihood to need special education and being held back for certain grades. And they're also more likely to graduate high school and also maybe even go on to higher levels of education if they graduate in college. Alright, so over here is a table of current programs available to LA Unified. One of the most popular options has been transitional kindergarten, as well as their expanded transitional program since 2012. This is a publicly funded program which is mandatory in every single school district, which is really nice. Since it's a rather flexible program, it allows for various modifications depending on what the school's resources are available, but generally does follow California Preschools Learning Foundation guidelines as a general level basis. And unlike preschools, teachers are required to have various credentials which are necessary for kindergarten teachers, which is more academic, and so this is definitely a benefit to having transitional kindergarten in schools. However, one of the issues is because even though it's a very flexible program, this does allow for a large amount of vagueness. And so it's very hard to implement on a larger scale, considering that it allows for a large degree of flexibility. So it's hard to standardize. There's also the Head Start program, which is a federally funded program, and it's generally aimed more towards low-income families. It also does aim towards parent education as well, which is an extended benefit of the program. However, one of the issues is that since there's a limited number of slots, it's generally more selective, and so priority is given to various programs and various different welfare states. And also there's a large amount of invisibility for homeless families in this issue, considering they're not necessarily visible to federal levels. And also there's First 5 LA, which is a child welfare advocacy group. It's an organization which generally advocates not only for better educational standards, but also for better health standards. This includes increased vaccinations and trying to give every single child a level of insurance. And currently, even though they're not themselves an educationally based educational group, they're currently partnered with Los Angeles Universal Preschools. And this is one of the nation's actually most acclaimed preschool programs, and requiring a large amount of preschool to be mandatory for a large amount of children, for all of them under the ages of 4, and generally this is seen as very successful, as approximately 70% of the graduates who from LAUP actually go on to LAUSD, and they're involved in a large number of gifted programs there. However, one of the issues with this, of course, is considering that First 5 LA's funding comes from a lot of state cigarette taxes. As California's health generally increases, there's fewer number of cigarette smokers. And so there's, in the future, there may be various issues considering the funding for how we're going to find the dollars to fund this program. So as previously mentioned with the various programs, there's obviously some issues with early care and education, which my colleagues will also talk about later. Because LAUSD is one of the largest school districts in the nation, there's a huge population of toddlers and infants in the region, and so this leads to a very high demand for early care and education, but there's a very limited number of slots. So to many children, it's rather inaccessible. Also, ever since the Great Recession, there's been a minimal levels of state funding for various programs, and so this also contributes to a lower level of accessibility. And another factor to potentially consider is Los Angeles' really diverse populations. There's a lot of children who don't speak English in the home, and so are dual language learners, and the current programs don't necessarily accommodate for these types of learners in the system. And if you go on to the next slide. And currently in LA, this just demonstrates that how 51% of state toddlers and infants in LAUSD are eligible for state subsidized programs, while only 6% actually have access to these programs. And so this is an issue largely because of the limited number of dollars and the limited number of slots. And so next, my colleague Thomas is going to talk about the achievement gap in LAUSD.
Hi, my name is Thomas. I chose to look at the achievement gap in Los Angeles in education and try to find out which groups experience this gap in education the most. And so I started off my research by looking at how bilingual learners, looking at that community to see if there was they're getting left behind by the program or by LAUSD, and I chose to look at the Latino population primarily because 40% of people in the LA metro area speak Spanish primarily in the home, and I found that Latino students in LA are 36% less likely to graduate high school than the average Californian high school student. And so if we go on to the next slide,
You're good.
okay, so if we look at these graphs over here on the right, I found the top graph shows the education gap in LA broken down by race, and I found that each category contained non-English speakers, and even though there were large proportions in the Chinese community of non-English speakers, their education was the highest of any group, and there were not a lot of non-English speakers in the Black community, and they were at the worst. They had the biggest education gap. And so I found a lot of supporting research that basically found no causal link between being bilingual and having access to early childhood education and later achievement outcomes. And so the real determining factor in education was found to be socioeconomic status. Primarily low-income families had less access to ECE and performed worse as their educational careers go on. The gap gets wider and wider. So the bottom graph here shows the breakdown of educational achievement by income, and you can see clearly that in the language arts and in math, the gaps between low-income and non-low-income families are much larger than anything else. So looking to a solution for this achievement gap problem, I found a model from Minnesota created by an economist named Art Rolnick. And basically, the program was based on this Perry preschool longitudinal study of 30 years. They provided parental mentors, basically education coaches to parents, even before their child was born. They would send this educational coach to low-income families, tell them about all the programs that were available, why it was important that their child should take advantage of these programs. And then going beyond that, the program provided them with a scholarship to choose an early childhood education for their child, to kind of give the parents the choice in which program to put their kid in. And that addresses the real root of the problem, which is parent engagement. And it's really hard for low-income families to be very engaged with their child's education compared to non-low-income families, because they're working maybe multiple jobs. They have a lot of, they're just fighting for basic needs, basically. And because of that, there's a lack of knowledge about the programs that are actually available to help them. And so the Minnesota model provides these scholarships and these mentors. And I think this program, if we go to the next slide, I think this program could really be applied to LAUSD, beginning with the mentorship program, not necessarily providing the expensive scholarships right up front, but I think beginning investing some money in providing a mentorship for low-income families, just to allow them to take advantage of all the educational opportunities that there are. Like Vivian said, only 6% of low-income families have actually taken advantage of programs that do exist, even though 50% of families are eligible. So I think just kind of a knowledge campaign, but also demonstrating why it's important. And then further bridging, adapting this model to Los Angeles, I think having a culturally sensitive and bilingual mentor would really be able to close the gap between immigrant families and the education system, and kind of demonstrating why it's very important for their child to have their educational needs met before they even get to kindergarten.
Okay. So hi, my name is Justin, and I'll be talking about the staffing issues within early childhood education, particularly about the lack of men in the profession. So first, in general staffing statistics, the average preschool teacher makes $28,890 a year, while an average childcare worker makes $22,290 a year. The biggest difference between a pre-K teacher and a childcare worker is that a pre-K teacher has an associate's degree. That there are a total of 1.7 million early childhood educators in the United States. However, only 3.2% are men, and that number hasn't changed over the past 10 years. Although this issue has only been recently spotlighted in the United States, worldwide, particularly in Europe, they have had measures to try to combat this issue. In 1996, the European Commission of Childcare set a 20% benchmark of male involvement in early childhood education, set to be met by 2006. It is currently 2018, and no European country has gotten to half that percentage, with the current leaders worldwide right now being Norway at 9% and Denmark and Spain at 8%. Why gender diversity is important and why we should care. So I'm going to first talk about why it's important. The first is the social gender norms. Childcare in the United States started in the mid-19th century when working class families hired young working class women to take care of their children while they were at work. And this kind of stigma that women were better at taking care of children kind of follows that profession until today. The second reason why is that there's low pay and limited upward mobility. Like I mentioned earlier, the average salaries for a pre-K teacher and a childcare worker are $28,000 and $22,000 respectively. The average salary for a single male in the United States is about $34,500. So, and because there's the social stigma that men should be the breadwinners within a family, it makes the profession unattractive. Furthermore, because there's no upward mobility within the early childhood education profession as a teacher, you see a lot of men take on administrative roles as they can climb the quote-unquote professional ladder in that regard. The third and possibly the most troubling reason why there are so few men is because of the potential accusations of child abuse and sexual harassment. Clearly, no one wants to work in an environment where they're under constant threat of an unfounded accusation, especially when it affects not just your professional life, but also your personal life. Why we should care. The first reason why is teaching gender roles and gender equality. Women, just like how women have made great strides in pursuing and achieving success in traditionally male-dominated fields over the past 20 years, in order to have true gender equality in the workforce, men have to succeed in traditionally female-dominated fields. Second is to have a positive male role models, especially for single mother households. Studies show that male role models or father figures lower the chance of incarceration and drug abuse, while also increasing the chances of graduating high school and attending college. And what better place than the classroom to find those kind of role models. The third reason why is the diversity in teaching styles. There was a study done by the Maine Boys Network back in 2003 where they interviewed young boys about what their least favorite part of school was, and one of the main reasons why was female teachers generally showed more interest in young girls' interest in hobbies, and not so much in the boys' interest in hobbies. An example from a Boston educator would be he would always see female teachers braid young girls' hairs in class, but he would never see them throw a football with a boy. And that's just like a very small example, but it's representative of the larger issue. Having a diverse teaching force would just make for a better, more well-rounded experience for all the students. And now we're talking my two recommendations. The first is to create a West Coast version of the Call Me Mr. program. The Call Me Mr. program was founded in 2000 by Dr. Roy Jones at Clemson University, and its original goal was to increase the number of African American males in elementary school systems. When it was first created, there were only 200 minority male teachers in 600 public schools in the state of South Carolina, while the teaching pool was 20,000. Since then, Call Me Mr. has placed 228 fully qualified teachers into the elementary schools of South Carolina, with over 230 students currently enrolled in the program. And also, it has expanded mostly in the southern region, where there are now 30 affiliate programs across the South, across 9 different states. And also, another benefit of having a version of a Call Me Mr. program is that it's privately funded through the university and corporate sponsorships. For example, Wells Fargo has donated $1.56 million to the program since its inception, and recently DuPont has donated $300,000 to start the University of Richmond chapter of Call Me Mr. The second recommendation I have is to have compensation parity within LAUSD. This study was done by Marcy Whitebrook at the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment. The definition of compensation parity is guaranteed equal salary for pre-K teachers with their K-3 teaching counterparts, as long as they have the same qualifications, credentials, and work hours. There are currently 5 states and 2 cities that have full compensation parity, according to Marcy Whitebrook, and I believe the one that would best fit the needs of LAUSD is the Abbott program out of New Jersey, not only because they have full compensation parity, but also because they have, they give free pre-K education to 3 to 4-year-olds in certain low-income communities in New Jersey. And now I'm going to turn it over to Shernae for about accessibility.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Shernae Hughes. Now, as my colleague previously said, Thomas, that socioeconomic status is the primary factor that determines the wide disparities in the achievement gap. So today I'm going to discuss a little bit more about my research, specifically focusing on social and economic barriers to access to these types of programs for low-income communities, and moreover, how to best allocate state fundings to increase accessibility. Okay, so first and foremost, it's rather a question of access. So 71% of California's 4-year-olds are not enrolled in publicly funded preschool programs, versus New York, for example, where it's only 39% not enrolled. And so what we have is a huge crisis of families just not being able to have access to it. And moreover, as Vivian said earlier, 51% of Los Angeles' babies and children are eligible for state subsidized care. However, only 6% ultimately utilize this. And it's largely because of very little access to state-funded programs in low-income communities and the wait lists that are there in the very few programs that they have. Because 60% of early childhood education, the cost of it is absorbed by individual families, low-income communities cannot simply afford to not go through the traditional means of the wait list and go to privately funded preschool programs because they don't have the financial means to do so. So ultimately, a brainchild study found that higher income directly correlates to better educational opportunities, which again then correlates to potential educational disparities as the child grows up. Go ahead. A large reason for this is the social stigma. Many different programs point to social stigma as primary reasons why low-income communities do not participate in preschool programs. Oftentimes, the narrative is that early childhood programs are simply babysitting, or that they're too young to benefit at that age. However, studies have shown that 90% of a child's development is done by the age of 5. And so if we're talking about lifelong ability to advance in different areas and fields, a lot of the work for a child happens prior to age 5. Additionally, many advocates insist that it's not worth the money, but a RAND study in 2005 emphasized that every $1 invested in early childhood education saves $7 later on in costs for remedial education, welfare, and prisons. So it's very important to emphasize that this is not just an individual thing, but an issue that has stakes in the entire community. Moreover, programs tend to focus on, the large issue is the social stigma. So programs such as First 5 LA really emphasize awareness campaigns to increase families' understanding of the importance of preschool programs. However, the largest issue ultimately is accessibility, and that there are very few programs in low-income communities. So the Quality Rating and Improvement System, or QRIS, is utilized in California in order to determine which funds will go to which programs. Again, it's a systematic approach to assessing quality, improved programming, and communication for early education programs. So this is determining, does a facility have proper infrastructure to get funding? Are the staffers qualified? As Justin said earlier, preschool teachers ultimately need to have associate's degrees, so there's an educational component as well. However, for low-income communities, a large issue is, although that there's a large need for their children to be out of the house, because if you're impoverished, oftentimes you may have to work 2 or more jobs, and during that time you need a place for your child to be taken care of. So while there's a lot of daycare systems, whether that's sending your children to homes or just somebody you know in the community, a large problem is that they just sit there, and that there's not necessarily an educational component. And because they are daycare centers and not preschool programs, they're not state funded and don't have access to improve their systems or even get educational means as well. There's the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge, which is a $500 million statewide initiative specifically working to combat educational disparities that begin in early childhood programs. And again, they assess how they're going to allocate these funds based on any given institution's facilities and educational outcomes. So my colleague will touch a little bit upon how we can potentially work to transform the many daycare centers in low-income communities into programs that have educational components as well.
All right, hi everyone, my name is Stepan Petrosyan, and I'll be talking about budgetary and funding barriers that a person might come across when they're looking to open a child care center in their immediate communities to benefit early child care education. Now, there are 2 possible options. As you can see up there, one of them is called Child Care Centers, abbreviated as CCC, and the other one is called Family Child Care Homes, which is abbreviated as FCCH. Now, the paramount difference between the 2 is that FCCH provides no immediate or long-term educational benefit for the children, as Shernae mentioned earlier, since the state doesn't require for the teachers to have any accreditation. So they pretty much become daycare centers. To open a family child care center, the person, he or she simply needs to go through an orientation, acquire and pay for business licenses, and go through a LAUSD fingerprinting process. However, for a child care center, it's a much more difficult process where an individual needs to first find a commercial location because the state does not allow CCCs to be open in residential areas. They later need to get a mandatory fire department clearance as well as liability insurance prior to applying for the application for CCC. In addition, they need accredited teachers and a director, and depending on the amount of children at the facility, they also need a nurse on staff and that's if a number of children passes 80. Next, next we will compare and contrast the cost between CCC and FCCH. For CCC, numbers reflected in a facility that can accommodate 61 to 75 students, which is the average number that CCC could have in a given facility according to state licenses. In contrast to FCCH, the numbers reflect 14 students, which is the maximum amount of students that a state allows a residential facility to have with the fire department clearances. So the licenses for the CCC sum up to over $1,600. Remodeling and renovations, which are required by the state to state standards and safety state standards and safety codes, comes up to an average of $41,000. This is summed up for about 60 to 70 children per facility. In addition, there is startup costs, which are listed on the bottom left column, and they total up to $96,000, and this includes educational supplies, indoor and outdoor equipment, kitchen and housekeeping supplies, utility deposits, insurance for liability, marketing expenses, as well as working capital for 3 months. Now, I have included a working capital that includes staff salary for 3 months because this is a for-profit business, and for it to be sustainable, it either needs to show immediate profit or it needs to have backup funds. So I've implied 3 months of backup funds for this numbers. So the total amount for CCC comes up to over nearly $140,000. In contrast to FCCH, as you can see on the bottom right corner, it's a little over $24,000. Now the big difference in costs are between FCC and CCHs in LAUSD shows why there's 3 times less child care centers in LAUSD in comparison to FCCH. Since they're much more cost effective to open, a lot of people go for that option first before they apply to CCCHs. Now this relates to Vivian's point of there not being enough opportunities for children that actually qualify for these programs. There's just not enough facilities for them to attend to, specifically in low-income neighborhoods. Now there are, so there are some grants and solutions. There are a lot of private donors, however, they're not available in low-income communities. There's also a operational grant that allows facility to use 15% of the grant towards operational costs. However, that's a very small amount, small dent into an issue when the total price is $140,000. The biggest opportunity is into the Head Start program, as Vivian mentioned earlier. So this program had started in 1965, and in the last 3 years, there has been 37 grants dispersed across the United States. And these grants are awarded directly to public and private nonprofit organizations. The most recent grant that was allocated towards Los Angeles was in 2016 for over $8.4 million that went towards South LA and Compton school areas. Some of the solutions that I've come up through my research for this issue is to increase state and federal funding and direct it towards specifically early childhood education development of facilities. Create a high quality CCC facilities and also offer operational funding increases for participants in improvement programs through the state. Now next, my colleague Milton is going to go through some more solutions for this issue. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon everyone. My name is Milton. I'm going to be talking about the policy solutions in implementing early childhood education as well as dual language programs. In addition, going to be summarizing the policy the solutions that my colleagues also brought up. So the policy, could you reload the page? Sorry, there's like an image that isn't being showed there. No, the back. No, the next one. Yeah, there's like, yeah, I don't know why it's not showing it.
There we go.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the two policy solutions in implementing these programs. The first of which being the Reformation of Proposition 13. So if you're a homeowner, you definitely know what Proposition 13 is. as well as implementing a countywide parcel tax. And that one right there, yes, on Measure A, is actually from Kenfield Unified School District, which I'll be talking about a little bit more into further depth. Proposition 13, so implementing a split rule. So to give a little bit of background on Proposition 13, it was approved on June 6 of 1978 by Californian voters. And basically what it deals with is the reason it was passed was because of the rising property taxes that kept going from different communities, different counties, different towns, unfortunately, that it just wasn't a consistent number. And so what California voters voted on was keeping that level at 1% and making sure that inflation doesn't go up more than 2% a year. So essentially what it does is businesses, homeowners, and people who own commercial properties will still pay the value of what their house was assessed in 1975. So take, for instance, Hollywood. If you bought a house in Hollywood that was worth $100,000 and you still have ownership of it, and now you're in 2018, that house is well worth over $2-3 million, but yet you're still paying that 1% of what it was originally in 1975. So that's property taxes that could be going towards programs like public education, dual language programs, early childhood education. In addition to that, promoting sort of fields like STEM, as well as renovating and updating facilities. So to give a little bit more description of this, so this is actually from the State Board of Equalization, that basically says that of the homeowners that pay the 72% in residential type properties, 38% are actually homeowners that are paying, as well as that extra 34%. That 28% is what businesses are paying. So 28% of what makes up property taxes are what businesses are paying. So that seems like a big loophole right there that unfortunately isn't being addressed. So what are measures that businesses are doing in order to make sure that they're not paying this extra tax? Because essentially once the value of a property is reassessed, then the number of taxes goes up. So what businesses have done to avoid paying higher taxes is by whenever a shareholder joins in on the company, that original owners will still have some form of property ownership, and therefore it doesn't trigger any sort of reassessment value of the property. So that's money that could go towards public education, but it isn't. And so for the next one would be implementing a countywide parcel tax. So to give a little bit of background on what a parcel tax is, it's a form of real estate tax that isn't based on property, but rather, and it's used commonly in California for K-12 schools, public education, and it actually originated in response to Proposition 13 because schools weren't getting the funding. Essentially, a parcel tax measure requires a supermajority, so two-thirds vote, which people in counties and in school districts actually vote on. So to give a little bit of information, so on the right-hand side from 1983 to 2014, 56% of parcel tax elections passed with 56%. 37% failed but did have a majority, so had over 50%. And then 7% failed but had no majorities. Therefore, it's a common theme that Californians are willing to pay higher taxes if it means that this money, that all these extra taxes would be going towards public education and towards their children. Next slide, please. In summarization, the importance of early childhood education, it helps develop and social and emotional skills that will be beneficial to students later in life. The achievement gap, so 56% of LA metro area students speak language other than English. 42% of Latino children test in the bottom 25% of their peers in readings. In grade second, in the second grade, LA are 36% likely to Spanish-speaking Latinos are 36% less likely to graduate high school than the average Californian. Bilingual parent engagement mentors, as well as implementing growth and high-quality programs that fits the needs of the community by 85% are very essential in order to help the achievement gap. Social and economic barriers to access for low-income families. Money should be allocated towards transforming daycare centers into preschool programs in low-income communities to increase accessibility and encourage entrepreneurship. Budgeting and funding barriers, increase federal and state funding incentives for improvement programs participation, effective early childhood education, workforce development, and other incentives for residents' use. And lastly, staffing issues. So pre-K teachers are guaranteed equal salary and benefits within the K through 3 teaching counterparts, provided that they also have the same credentials, certifications, and work hours. Next slide. Thank you. And this concludes our presentation. Thank you very much.
Very good. Good job, guys. Well done. All right, so we've got time for Q&A, and so we'll defer to our provider as we always do, but we're really looking for anyone to ask any questions that they would like to with regard to the presentation or anything related to early childhood.
Okay, I guess Art just deferred to me. So, great job. I had to get up and talk in front of a room this morning, and you guys probably did better than I did, and I think I knew what I was supposedly talking about. So it's always really impressive. This feels like Shark Tank a little bit. That's a little.
I feel like it's a little more casual than we're used to.
Yeah. And I tried to take down questions, like specific questions for all of you, but I think a broad one to start off is just, if you were gonna talk to family, maybe friends, if you have friends who'd be interested in this kind of thing, you know, how would you sort of talk about the importance of the issue, maybe sell the importance of the issue? There's a Shark Tank kind of reference.
Yeah.
And which of the, you can go into somebody else's area, which policy would you be pushing? Would you say, so basically like, I just learned about early childhood. This is why it struck me as being really important. And this is one policy change that I think our state should make that would make the most impact. That makes sense?
I would say that.
Go ahead.
I would say the most important how I would sell it would be using Shernae statistics of like $1.
Yeah, for every $1 invested, save $7 in welfare, prisons, and remedial education. I think I would definitely say first and foremost that 90% of the child's brain is developed by the age of 5. And so we're talking about entire lifetimes of potential disparities that may exist from this, early opportunity to kind of get involved in the child's education. And so I would say that a large issue is just making sure that these resources are accessible to everyone. And so more than anything else, my focus would be primarily on increasing accessibility.
I think if I had to sell early childhood education with one statistic that I came across during my research, it would be that by the age, or by second grade, if you compare kids that had access to high quality ECE and kids that didn't, there is a 40% chance, or the kids that did have access to high quality education early on had a 40% higher chance of having an IQ measured over 90. And so while IQ might not necessarily be the most scientific way to talk about education, I think that if I was talking to the average family and you say something like that, like this will make your kids measurably smarter and more prepared for the world, that could kind of, at least gain support from somebody who maybe didn't really care about like sending their kids to school so early because it wasn't worth it. So I think just kind of showing the actual measured effects of sending your kids to school early might sway somebody.
So if we assume that you've persuaded me, but now we have to pay for it, what do you think is the most effective means to, you threw a lot of numbers up there that I think were very enlightening, but I'm still not really sure about how, some of those numbers were frightening in terms of the costs.
They are, and they're frightening to have a state budget allocated towards a private business in such big numbers. So I believe that these numbers, if there was a budget allocated towards this, I think it should be directed by the state, and there shouldn't be these private childcare centers. These should be state-directed childcare centers that provide accredited teachers that teach bilingualistic curriculums as well as maybe English and math and things like that. So if they were to be taken out of the private sector and put into, I guess, government's hands, and that way they'll be implemented into low-income neighborhoods versus leaving it up to private donations that ended up in middle class or.
So maybe the funding for these centers for certain communities, not necessarily for the more affluent communities that can already afford it, but maybe for lower working class communities that really, even if they wanted, they can't have
They
it.
can't. Even if they wanted to open an FCCH, which only costs 24,000, that's still really far. And I'm not even talking about 140,000 that's required to, and they can't even do it in the neighborhood. They got to go somewhere else where there's a commercial zoning laws apply, and then they can start even trying to do that. But
So your two subject matters, I think, are colliding here a little bit in an interesting way. And I'm thinking, talking about making sure that the child care centers have some sort of, are either state-run or maybe a pretty high degree of state control. And then, and I'm gonna pull a little bit of extra knowledge here, because I just talked to Art Rolnick within the last few months. Fascinating guy. He can really convince you on this stuff, by the way. And his Minnesota model is very much based in private, market-driven. You know, these are private places, and you know, basically you're giving families, $15,000, and they get to go choose, and the ones that meet their needs and do a good job thrive, and ones that don't fail. So I'm wondering if you guys see either a place where what you're both kind of, I mean, because you talked about this, so I'm talked about where what you're saying lines up, or are there places, or do you guys feel like you're in disagreement, which is fine too?
I think that, I think I agree with some of the research that you found and disagree with other parts. I think that this Minnesota model could be used in conjunction with funding mechanisms that already exist. So maybe pull from that budget to pool into the budget allocation for these scholarships, because a lot of the kids that are using the scholarships are going to be going to the publicly funded program. So they'll be paying for extra services when they get there. The Art Rolnick's paper describes the most expensive children in this program were the ones that actually went to state-funded programs, and the ones that went to private programs got similar or better education and paid, in a lot of cases, less than half of the kids that went to state-funded programs. So I think that maybe if you looked at like the breakdown of which students are going to end up choosing which program and kind of moving money around a little bit from existing funding programs to this new one, that maybe you could find some common ground. But I think ultimately the only way to really bring new ECE services to the communities that need it most is to create demand, like private demand for these new ECE centers to pop up by giving the community there these scholarships.
Well, I think I kind of agree with you. I think if there were to be created a competitive, accessible way for someone to apply for these loans, then maybe there will be more incentive for X amount of people in the lower community to want to open these type of facilities. And then how does the state decide which person actually gets the funds? And if they do, and there's nothing nearby that can be counted as a commercial zoning, then where does the school go? So now the school goes way too far out, people can't really get to it. So I guess a competitive, acceptable way of applying for these loans could maybe align with what you were talking about.
I wonder if, so we've got the interest and now we figure out the funding mechanism, but you still are building these probably primarily in, lower socioeconomic areas,
right,
with people that can't afford to send their kid there. How do you get beyond that bridge? So we built these wonderful places, but they don't can afford to send their kid there. So are we going back to the government again?
I can shed some light on that on the Abbott. I didn't have a chance to fully describe what the Abbott program is. So this is like, because New Jersey's in a unique situation with their pre-K system because of the New Jersey Supreme Court case Abbott versus Burke, where the Supreme Court ruled that high quality pre-K education has to be given given freely to 3 to 4 year olds in certain low income areas. And even though I understand like it's really hard like to have a court, like a landmark court case like that, having like a policy mandate of something similar interest where you can qualify, but like the accessibility issue is probably the bigger one than the actual like building of things.
Right.
So
I think they're probably both big.
They're really
Sounds
big
like
deal.
good.
Yeah, but that's just something like I think it's like a policy mandate would go a long way in helping that sort of issue.
Because a lot of the studies that I found kind of center around like the differences in how much of an impact early childhood programs make. So like I can't really remember the numbers off the top of my head, but like low income families who participate in education programs early on have wide impact later on down their life versus people who are middle or higher income. There's only a very slight increase. So then I think that's primarily about, because the market exists, and that's why that there is so many preschool programs in middle and higher income families and communities rather. So I think it's about specifically and purposefully allocating funds to lower income communities in mass to, one, increase the actual facilities, but also make it possible for the many people who do already have daycare centers to just go ahead and take that extra step, get also state funding, meet certain higher qualifications, and then open up preschool programs.
Can I ask a question about the Minnesota model? You talked about a mentorship program, which, I mean, studies have shown if you have a mentor, you are more likely to succeed. But you talked about implementing it here in LA, so I'm just wondering, how would you start that?
So I think that it would require hiring people that are very familiar, maybe even teachers that already work in the within early childhood education, and just setting up a program where they go meet with a certain number of families in their non-school hours, and basically telling them all about the programs that exist, and kind of training that mentor about maybe all the economic incentives, not incentives, but economic opportunities to go to these state-funded programs, and talk about which ones are in the area, and maybe like childhood care, just all the state-funded childhood care things, but also telling them why they should take advantage of it, and maybe help connect parents to do like carpool and stuff to try to like make it more accessible to these families, because if a kid gets off work or off school at 3 and you're still at work, it's difficult. So maybe just connecting families together could be a potential.
And is it a paid, or is it like a volunteer service?
It would be these teachers would get paid for their time for doing this. So, and I think that would be a lot cheaper than just giving scholarships out, because you already have the teachers just paying for a couple hours a week to go meet with new families.
Like a social worker.
Yeah, I think it would be. I think it would have to expand into that territory a lot. So maybe utilizing the existing social work programs.
Okay.
I wanted to add another solution towards making it more affordable for people to be able to take their kids towards child care centers. I found this through my research that this might not be an option up front, but in the long run, offering a tax refund at the end of the year for expenses made towards child care center tuitions, I guess, for people in the low-income families. So I guess come up with the income number, and if you're below that income number, then you get the money you spent towards your kid.
Or maybe it's a combination of both of these, right? You've got maybe the tax refund, which is the government end of it, and then you end up going with a parcel tax. I mean, let's be honest, I don't think Prop 13 is going anywhere. You know, it would be very hard to change. Do you think, Steve?
Yeah, I think it's been pushed now to 2020, right? I think the measure. And it's such a, it's hard.
I'm not saying it couldn't be done. What's going to happen is all the people eventually that could take advantage of it are going to die off. But you know, it does carry on from generation to generation. So I think that politically speaking, in this environment, I think it'd be very difficult. Now, parcel taxes are different.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of those too.
Yeah, well, I mean, LA County this week is talking about one for storm drain, stormwater, and like 3 or 4 cents per foot. You know, I mean, I think it's like a $75 for your, your sort of.
But it adds up, right?
It adds up.
You ever look at your property tax? It's just a list of parcel taxes.
Yeah. But I think so. You talked about parcel tax. Oh, I know I had a thought. Oh no, it was just your tax credit. Colorado actually has a really big tax credit for this stuff, which was really weird for some reason. I guess at some point they had a crisis in, as much as we have a crisis in not having child care centers, they had a serious one, and they actually got a tax credit in. That's another thing probably would never happen. Maybe in a different governor. I want to try to, I mean, I want to, I have, like I said, I have like specifics in here. You know, since early on, I said that you were either going to probably do really well or crash and burn. And you did well. I didn't think it was
Thank goodness you didn't say crash and burn.
You know, I thought it was, certainly interesting, the child abuse part, potential, because I remember McMartin Preschool, which was like one of the big notorious ones that I had friends who went to, and it was just crazy. Did you discover? Let me see. Where I put my question on this one is probably like way on the bottom, right? But I'm wondering if you came across actual research saying that. There's people saying that that's one of the reasons that they're not going into it.
That one's more not. That issue's more that people staying in that profession than people getting recruited into it. So there's a lot of like articles written by people in the profession. That say that's like the biggest fear for them. So there's some in some countries, and I think in the United States too, there's like a no touch policy if you're a guy as an early childhood educator. And there's also some places, I remember reading some places in Australia and England that don't hire men for these positions specifically out of that fear, right? So that's a very negative social stigma that not only affects recruitment, but also affects people wanting to stay in the profession.
Right. Starting out that sort of the professional world's kind of a no touch.
Yeah.
By the way, just FYI.
Yeah.
Coming in the middle of the Me Too movement too. It's like it's really, it's really interesting, and I think it's one that I want to float around to my peers, because like I said from the beginning, it's like not something I've heard about, but and we've talked about the compensation parity thing, which I've looked at, by the way. If you understand it, that's great, because I've read her stuff like over and over again. I'm just like, Marcy, what in the world are you talking about? And Marcy's great. She's really a terrific person.
Well, the one I recommended, the ABBA program, is not the best compensation parity out of the 6. It's just one I think is the most realistic in implementation, because San Antonio's compensation parity goes beyond it. So they offer $65,000 base salary for their pre-K teachers, while the average, it's a lot of money.
Maybe I'll get it.
While the average elementary school teacher only makes $45,000. But because I didn't pick that program, A, because of the funding issue, because it's really hard to fund that, but B, they only have 4 specific childcare centers in San Antonio that have that kind of facility that gives that kind of that salary. While in New Jersey, it's required statewide because of that court case.
Yeah, no, and it's certainly part of the push right now on workforce. So I think it's definitely out there. I just the way she argues it, I'm always like, I don't know what you're talking about. So
great. Well, I guess we're kind of pushing up against the hour here in just a little bit. I think you guys all did a really, really good job, and it's very clear to me. I did their last run through about 4 or 5 days ago. I've done a lot of work between now and then. But as I like to remind, all of our students, none of this could take place without our outside providers, and Steve Kahn has been a superstar with Unruh, and so I would like us to all thank Steve if we could. He gives his time, his efforts, and we give him no money. And so
it's even worse than being a child care provider. I was bitching to Art because my day was I was going to be downtown all day, but I ended up having to drive back to the office and then come back. So we need to figure out transportation issues too. Which is actually a big nexus.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you all, and good job.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
And before anybody leaves,